Morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to Eden's Open Educational Week. And we're starting off with a great session. I'm Denise Whitelock. I'm chairing this session. I'm Professor of Technology Enhanced Assessment and Learning. So what we've got in store for you is a session about assessment futures, what OU students tell us and how AI can help us respond. And of course, AI is on our minds most of the time, especially when we're thinking about assessment and doing the very best for our students' learning and success. Our first session is being led by Dr. Simon Cross, and he's going to be telling us and showing us insights from the CFAR program, which has been running for a number of years. He's a senior lecturer with us in IET, with a wealth of experience about student assessment, teaching and learning. So our other speakers are Professor Mirjam Hauck and Dr. Duygu Bektik, but I'm going to hand over first to Simon, we will then introduce the next speaker. Over to you, Simon. I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Denise, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for this session. What I hope to do today in the next 20-25 minutes or so is to share with you some perspectives from the students, from the university students at the OU, and in particular to focus on work that I've been involved with for over 10 years now, which is the CFAR program, which I'll introduce shortly. If you can, next slide, please, Duygu. Thank you. So, as many of you know, the OU is the UK's largest university and the largest distance teaching university, and our learners are extremely diverse. They are aged from 18 to retired, living across the UK, most often working, and in all life stages, with diverse educational and cultural backgrounds. And regular course assessment, that is 5 or 6 times over a 60 credit course or so, has always been a central part of our teaching approach, alongside, of course, the end of course assessment. And these regular assessment points have had a number of roles, not least in offering feedback and feed forward, in providing structure and engagement, and in giving learners the chance to reflect and consolidate on our learning. And of course, because the OU has had a VLE for 2 decades, there's been a myriad of tasks and activities associated with assessment, often for learning, that have increasingly moved online. And this is now reaching the point, of course, where most of that is happening, including most of our exams being managed on a digital platform. So for the university and for researchers, it's essential for us to understand the learner perspective, to understand this shift and the sustained shift. What has it been influencing and what has it been informing? So what I will do today is to provide some background, and hopefully this will help segue into the other 2 presentations today. I'll first of all introduce the CFAR survey. I'll talk about some trends that the data has been showing over the last 5 years. I'll say a little bit about some of the insight that we're getting from student attitudes towards assessment choice and personalisation. And then I'll focus in a little bit further on what the students have been telling us about their current use of AI for assessment tasks, and then summarise this up with a few emerging insights at the end. Next. So CFAR comes into the picture because of this need to understand the learner's perspective. CFAR stands for the Student Experience Feedback, Assessment and Revision, and it is a survey that attempts a broad take on the assessment process. It's one of a number of ways that, of course, the university monitors assessment experience, and this in-depth survey has happened every 5 years since 2015. Reason why revision is included there is for 2 reasons. The first one is that when originally developing the CFAR survey back in 2015, I felt that learning activity associated with revision, that is everything that happens between the end of a module and the exam, is important to include. But secondly, it reminds us that we need to be thinking about what comes before the assessment point as well as what comes after it. It was originally commissioned because OU staff felt they needed to understand more about the assessment experience. And this is borne out by the type of questions that we ask in the survey itself. We capture a representative sample of undergraduate students, and broadly speaking, there's a good profile to that response. As we've been very fortunate to have been repeating this in 2020 and 25, we now have a snapshot of 3 points, a longitudinal data set from which we can begin to look at trends, of course, across that period of time. Most importantly for today is the fact that in 2020, we added more questions around personalisation and choice in assessment. And then last year, which was the last time that the survey was conducted, we also added questions around the use and the usefulness of AI, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Thank you. So it makes sense when we're having these changes to ask about how we assess using digital technologies, what we understand by that. And in doing this, we also have an opportunity to look at something broader, to understand how assessment functions, not just as a method to verify student knowledge, but also assessment as a learning activity, how it engages, and also assessment as a social activity as well. So the survey comprises around 100 or so questions, which are grouped into themes. And on the right-hand side of this slide, I've given it a summary of the kind of things that the survey kind of covers. As I say, it takes quite a broad approach, and the purpose of that is so that we can try to understand learners' responses to any one of these elements in the context of the others. So, for example, looking at the bottom there, the question around AI tasks, for example, we have a whole variety of different other perspectives on that experience from which we can contextualize and hopefully make some further understandings. Some of these themes are quite well established. Some of them obviously a little bit more emerging. So next slide, please, Duygu. So looking at some of the trends from 2020, so comparing 2020 and 2025, I've pulled out 3 here where we've seen statistically significant improvements. Those are around essentially learners' organisation. Fewer struggle to submit their TMAs on time, which of course is a good thing. Fewer said that they felt anxious while writing their TMA, though the proportion of reporting has fallen over that period. And thirdly, there's an increase in those saying that they are enjoying writing the assessment, our tutor marks assessment. In some measures, this was stable, but in other elements, there was a slight increase there as well. Now, these first bullet points obviously may reflect some of the work that's been taken within the OU over those 5 years in terms of supporting learners better, although it clearly doesn't demonstrate causality necessarily. For me, what are the interesting things are where there has been no change despite technological shifts over those 5 years. So this is the final bullet point actually on this slide, where we compared the learner experience before COVID, which was when we were doing online exams face-to-face, and after, where we shifted online. And we were very fortunate because of the data set to be able to compare the two. And generally speaking, there seem to be no significant differences between those two. So that's an area where, despite there being changed, we haven't actually witnessed any impact on the overall experience. And above that, here are 3 examples that I pulled out where there have been falls. So a smaller percentage of learners saying that they agree or strongly agree that assessment really statements. So the first one, the in-course tutor marked assessments help them consolidate what they've learned so far. The second, that the assessment questions allow them to demonstrate what they had learned. And thirdly, they trusted their tutor to give them the feedback they needed. Now, there's been no significant change in how the OU assesses their assessment design over this period. So without that immediate explanation, potentially, how could some of these trends be described? And what I'd like to highlight perhaps as the first key finding here is that where there is no clear internal explanation for these observed changes, are there wider social, economic or cultural explanations to these patterns? And this may begin to sort of help us to sort of think about where AI fits in this and how AI, of course, is also impacting assessment more broadly. So next slide, please, Duygu. Within the survey as well, we also ask about student aspirations for assessment. So we ask a series of questions asking if they would like to see some of these aspects in their assessment in the future. Some of these are a little bit easier to interpret in terms of how the students respond than others. And it's reassuring to see, of course, that right there with about 4/5 of learners responding that they agree, we see the things we would expect. So 88% say that they would like to see the criteria that the tutor is using to mark their assessment, 82% wanting access to model answers, 77% wanting to be offered opportunities to talk with their tutor. Students do have that opportunity already, but I think this was interpreted as being more of a formal opportunity. So we would expect that. For me, I think it's this next sort of kind of block which is really interesting, and these are all related in some way or other to optionality, or to having students taking greater choice, or having a greater role and control in their assessment. And what we're looking at here is the majority of students now, and this has increased from 2020. So of these four, we have wanting a second view, wanting to have a say in the type of assessment questions and tasks, wanting to have a say in what feedback is received, and the option of receiving feedback from a draft. And the reason we included that, of course, is the fact that at the moment the OU feedback is provided after the TMA is submitted along with the grade. So an increasing interest from students for having more of a dialogue and having more control of their assessment. And that presents, of course, challenges in terms of how we may meet that demand, and why it is that students are expressing that in the first place. The other point I think here is the fact that the interest in receiving support for greater use of Gen AI in assessment is still low. It's still only about a quarter of learners. And maybe this tells us a couple of things. It certainly indicates there's a relatively low demand for support at the moment. That's not to say that support should not be there, but just maybe that the audience, the students at the moment, either don't see this as a priority, or don't prioritize this as much as some of those others. So this might impact how we approach the task of offering that support and how we engage with the learners. And secondly, of course, while we may focus on AI literacies, for example, this also helps to sort of make us mindful of the broader context, and that the learners will have a number of different types of things that they would like to see supported or improved within their module, of which that support for Gen AI is one of those. Next slide, please, Duygu. So I'm going to turn now and say a little bit about AI in assessment, and essentially what students have told us about how they've been using AI in assessment. The last survey was conducted last spring, so this is data that's obviously now around 9 months old. And I guess for me, as this is such a rapidly changing context, it does feel a little bit like trying to capture moving objects. And in a sense, I've just added this photo because it's a picture I've managed to catch of the least blurry picture I caught of a deer last year when I was in Chennai. But essentially what we're trying to do here is we're trying to sort of understand, as I say, a moving object. So for me, CFAR offers an opportunity to provide an institutional benchmark. It gives us an idea of where we were, obviously 9 months ago, and again, possibly where we might be heading as well. And for me, there are these 4 questions here. What proportion of students have used Gen AI for assessment? Are students finding Gen AI useful for assessment tasks? Which students are using Gen AI? And what are the implications of the patterns found for assessment design and support? So what we tried to do in CFAR was to look at and investigate these 4 questions. So click the next slide, please. So here is a summary of the top line headline I guess, responses that we received, we found that of those who responded, 18% were using AI for summarizing texts, learning materials, or research articles, specifically with respect to assessment. 20% were using it to spark ideas for creativity. 16% said they were using it for copy editing, rephrasing, or structuring text. 8% were using it for generating new content or text to add to assignments. 10% to set revision questions or quizzes, and 11% for giving feedback on a draft or final submission. So what we actually have here, these are 6 of the 10 items that we asked about in the survey. And I've chosen these because the first 2, the second 2, second pair, and the third pair all relate sort of kind of different aspects of that engagement. So whilst this might be quite low, we can then break that down, and we can also examine how useful the learners found AI. So this graph represents those 18, 19, 8% of learners. And what we see from this is the fact that the darker bar is very useful, which is on the right-hand side. Not at all useful is the palest blue bar on the left. So setting revision questions was found very useful by about a third of students. Summarizing text possibly sort of kind of comes in second in terms for its overall usefulness. And then we sort of kind of see, right, the one that least performing well, I guess, is the generating new content to add to my assignments. Still a number of students who are finding this moderately useful or very useful, but perhaps not the most useful of the ones that we've looked at there. So we're getting a sense of some students finding the GenAI useful or managing to engage it in successful ways, others less so. Of course, what a learner defines as being useful might be different to how we might define useful as well. Next slide, please, Duygu. So what I want to do is just very briefly to share with you a few sort of deeper insights, I guess. I'll share a little bit about the assessment scores and age, how those vary with AI use. And then I also wanted to say a little bit about variation by a number of different types of motivation. So we looked at mastery approach, performance avoidance approach, and strategic approach. So how does AI use vary with those across the student cohorts? Next. So before I do that, I think it's possibly just good to give you a kind of sneaky peek of the findings here, and that is that AI is use of the OU seems to be higher for younger students, especially age 25 or under, students whose highest previous qualification is below degree level. So that means in the UK context, an A level or A levels. Students receiving lower scores in the module assessment, students who are not highly motivated by mastery performance, and students who appear to adopt a strategic approach to completing their module. And we've got a few tables and graphs in the next few slides to dive into that a little bit further. So with respect to grade, what I've done here is I've taken the second assignment of a module. So not the first one, because those can often be quite light or can happen quite early, but the second module. And I've mapped the proportion of students, the percentage of students who are using AI for those 6 elements that we were looking at earlier. So summarizing, sparking ideas, editing, generating text, revision, and feedback. And I've divided the group into 4. So those on the left, 0 to 39, are those students who are not achieving a grade which is at the level to pass the module. Those who are getting 40 to 59 are those who are just passing. Those who are 60 to 79 are sort of kind of in the middle range, and those 80 to 100 are kind of in a sort of distinction sort of kind of category. And what we can see from this clearly is the fact that the greatest use is for those groups who are either not getting the score that will get them a pass, or who are sort of just on the other side of that. And that's true across all 6 rather of these different assessment tasks to a greater or to a lesser extent. Particularly interesting, I think, to note for example, with the 80 to 100 band on the right there, that you've got use for revision, for feedback, for example, which are only a matter of 5 or 6%, compared to those in the 0 to 39 group, where you've got 27, 28% who are saying that they're using it to help support with feedback. Next slide. And we can see something similar here in terms of the age breakdown. So we've got five age groups here, 25 and under, then in 10-year segments through to 56 and over. Again, very markedly notable difference. 25 and unders using this significantly more than the other groups. And underneath those legends, I've actually put the chi-square, the p numbers, just to give an indication of the fact that all but generating feedback are significant differences between age groups. So we've got the 25 and unders, of which over a third are using it for summarizing text and for sparking new ideas, but still relatively low use, of course, for generating content. Okay, so next slide, Duygu. So we've got those patterns, and we can also perhaps offer some hypotheses in terms of what we might expect with respect to student motivations and how AI use might relate to that. So what I'll do is in the next slide, I'll share the results of this, but here are these 4 hypotheses. So the first one is that students adopting a mastery approach will use AI in assessment less, and that is those who responded to this question wording that I've included in the brackets. The second is that students adopting a performance approach will be more tempted to use AI to gain advantage. The next hypothesis would be that those motivated by performance avoidance may potentially lean on the use of AI more. And finally, students who are wanting to spend as little time as possible studying, i.e. those who will adopt a strategic approach, may use AI more. So next slide, Duygu. With those 4 things in mind, we can look and do some pretty simple chi-square tests to see whether there are differences in response. And what we can see is there is clear evidence that there is difference in the first and the fourth. So I want to understand the module content as thoroughly as possible. There are significant differences. My aim was to pass the module with as least work as possible. There are significant differences. There doesn't seem to be evidence, at least from this initial analysis that we've undertaken, to indicate that those other 2 vary at all. There's no relationship there. So, Duygu, next slide. So what we can do is we can take a quick look at how the use is distributed across the responses to that statement. The Likert scale was a 1 to 7, so 7 being the highest and 1 being the lowest. Clearly, what we can see here is that those students who are strongly agreeing, that is, those who are saying 6 or 7, are using AI significantly less for assessment tasks than those who aren't as strong or aren't at all in agreement that they want to understand the module content as thoroughly as possible. And likewise, on the right, what we're looking at is those who disagree with the statement, their aim was to pass the module with as little work as possible. That is, those who said 1 or 2 are using AI significantly less than those who are agreeing with that statement more strongly. So some interesting patterns there, and I've just sort of overlaid a basic line here, and this one relates to the use of Gen AI for generating content or text that will be included in an assignment. And again, what one can see here is that it's down at about 5 to 8% for those who are in strong agreement or strong disagreement, depending on which one it is, but that is substantially higher for those at the either end of that. Okay, so next slide. So this comes us back to that sort of kind of third key finding, I guess, really, and that's just reflecting on the use of AI, Gen AI in the OU, and which learners seem to be using this more. And as I said before, this is clearly we see that younger students, especially those aged 25 and under, are using it more. Those with highest previous qualifications, I haven't shared the data for that, but that's there too. Students receiving lower scores in module assessment, And as we've seen, students who are not highly motivated by mastery performance and students who adopt a strategic approach to completing their module. So by way of a few final reflections before I pass on to Mirjam, the CFAR survey provides a benchmark from which we can understand and measure the onward change of usage in AI in assessment. And across the assessment tasks that we've looked at in the survey, and we also included an open-ended questions, which we still need to code and explore. This gives us a good place to, I guess, sort of be beginning to think about how we respond. One of those questions may be, are students losing out by not using AI for some assessment tasks? Or do they already feel that the existing approaches, the way they do things, are already working for them? And in the future, which uses would be more likely to support in preference to others? And indeed, are there? Another question, I guess, would be, what do we make of the patterns that we've observed from last year's assessment? Why are students using it to do this? And does this point to opportunities for improving learning engagement, improving assessment design, improving the support? And what are the implications of having a student cohort which is split between those who have and those who have not used GenAI? And I guess one could also add those who have found it useful and those who haven't found it useful and may have been put off. And should support, advice, and messaging around this differ between those student groups? And I guess finally, the extended measurement and benchmarking of assessment experience in new contexts is something that we need to pay attention to and continue to do. So we, I know at the OU, are looking forward to continuing this sort of kind of work in future and to extending the analysis of CFAR certainly more widely as we gather more data. So that is that hopefully has helped set the scene a little bit, and I think it's now my job to pass over to Mirjam. So over to you.
Thank you, Simon. I assume you can all hear me, and thank you. I'm Mirjam Hauck. I'm a professor for critical digital pedagogies at the Open University, and I'm also an academic lead for AI in learning, teaching, and assessment. And I come here to talk to you about critical AI literacy skills development in learning, teaching, and assessment, with critical meaning through the social justice and inclusion lens. And this is very much on the agenda at the Open University at the moment. So I'll first say a few words about the institutional context and the wider context in the UK higher education climate. I will, of course, say a little bit more about what critical AI literacy is. I will present the framework we have developed, and I will then very quickly zoom in and show you two very concrete examples, one from a social sciences context and one from a STEM context. So what it looks like when we start to systematically embed critical AI literacy skills development into assessment. And then, like Simon, I will finish with a few thoughts on what's next at the OU and hopefully beyond. And by the way, all the images I'm using in my presentation, they stem from a project called Better Images of AI. They are all downloadable and usable. They are published under Creative Commons license. The project is organically growing as time goes by. And what is special about these images is that they have explicitly been created without the use of AI because of the carbon footprint impact. Okay, so we have a teaching and learning plan at the Open University where we commit that we are going to ensure that the use of new learning systems, technological innovation, such as AI, enhances our efficient delivery of high-quality teaching and assessment. And of course, it also acknowledges that staff need to develop their AI literacy, if only to be in a position to help students to develop theirs subsequently. And we have a set of enabling principles for generative AI in learning, teaching, and assessment. And I would like to draw your attention to the second of those principles. This is the use of generative AI in learning, teaching, and assessment being anti-racist, anti-discriminatory, and accessible and inclusive. And a university where a third of the learners come from a widening participation background, you can probably tell that this is particularly relevant for us. And it is, of course, also this embedding generative AI into learning, teaching, and assessment also sits within our strategic priority number one, our current strategic priority number one, of the OU's University People Plan, that is to develop an inclusive and empowering culture and work environment. And now moving into what's happening in higher education in the UK and beyond, I'm bringing to you a quote from the Higher Education Policy Institute from October 2025, where our attention is drawn to the move from policing the use of AI to pedagogically embedding the use of AI, from policy to pedagogy. And it encourages us to move away from this fixation with academic misconduct and the refinement of development of detection tools, and to look much more closely on how AI can support active learning. Yeah. And they were able to show a direct correlation between the ethical use of AI for learning and improved student attainment and retention. And that was particularly noticeable among students that are often described as non-traditional, those from a non-traditional background, from a widening participation background. We have up to a third, as I mentioned, up to a third of our learners come from such a background. Hence, this move from policing to pedagogy is particularly relevant at the Open University. Okay, so critical AI literacy, what is it? Well, let's look first at what AI literacy is. I'm sure you have come across this very, very popular quote by Long and Magerko, who describe it as a set of competencies that enables individuals to critically evaluate AI technologies, to communicate and collaborate effectively with AI, and use AI as a tool online, at home, school, and in the workplace. Yeah, it is different. It is slightly different from how we currently conceptualize and teach digital literacy. Okay, so because it has this critical dimension that everyone is talking about. However, when I talk about critical AI literacy, I talk about critical in a different sense, more akin to critical digital literacy and critical digital literacy skills development, which is about highlighting the influence of power, how power operates in digital spaces. It's about exploring how knowledge, identities, and relationships are shaped in ways that privilege some online and marginalize others. And it's about systematically equipping individuals with tools and strategy to analyze the linguistic, but also the non-linguistic features and affordances of digital media, and to help them so that they can themselves identify embedded biases and assumptions. And so similarly, critical AI literacy examines how large language models contribute to ongoing epistemic injustices. As I've mentioned, it applies the lens of equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility to the use of AI, and promotes a more diverse AI education, and does, of course, require self-reflective mindsets. So self-reflection, as you will see in a moment, plays a core role in the development and in the teaching and the learning of critical AI literacy. What both critical digital literacy and critical AI literacy have in common is that they are, of course, specific, and they see literacy as but it's also something that you do. And how you do that, you will see in a moment when I share my examples. And so in that sense, critical AI literacy expands the critical thinking and the critical evaluation dimension of AI literacy. So it is critical because it puts the lens on social justice and inclusion. So together with colleagues from the Open University Library, with colleagues from our LDS Generative AI Learning Design team, and from Careers and Employability at the OU, we have designed this framework. At the moment, it has 6 entry points. It is, as with all things in the AI space, an organic product, and will have to develop along with pedagogical and insights and technological advancements. But being AI illiterate in this critical sense means having the tools and strategies to evaluate AI-generated outputs through the EDIA lens, grounded in EDIA principles, and being able to engage also in equitable and inclusive prompting on the input side as and when required and appropriate. So the 6 dimensions of the framework are AI concepts and applications, learning and teaching with AI, being creative with AI, AI creativity, ethical issues around AI, AI ethics, AI in society, impact on global agency, and the societal and environmental impact of AI, but also AI careers, as in becoming AI career ready with AI and in AI times. And with each, here you have the link embedded to the framework, and with each of these dimensions come concrete suggestions as to how you can do this in learning and teaching and assessment. That is, embed AI creativity, embed considerations about AI in society, embed work on AI ethics. Okay, now, after this bit of cognitive lifting, let's make it very concrete and show you what happens when you walk the talk. My first example is a social sciences assignment. And you look at the traditional way of how this assignment has been presented so far to the students. So we have defining and contextualizing citizenship. Define citizenship as used in social sciences, an introduction, that's an OU module, showing how your definition emerges from at least 2 sources or activities from weeks 1 to 3 of your module. And then you are asked to explain why you selected these bespoke sources and what alternative interpretations you've considered as a student. And then you are supposed to connect your definition to one example from your own context for personalization. And then you are asked to critically evaluate how different cultural, social, and geographic contexts might shape varying definitions of citizenship. Now, here now in the new bit, the AI-assisted research and critical evaluations, our students are being asked to use Copilot. That's the tool, the GPT we are using at the OU. To use Copilot to explore how citizenship is understood across different global contexts. And they're explicitly asked to evaluate the outputs through the equality, diversity, inclusion, and access lens. So the students are asked to generate 3 different prompts using Copilot to explore citizenship definitions and to make sure that at least one explicitly requests perspectives from marginalized or underrepresented communities. And then they have to document and engage, critically engage with the AI outputs and to identify potential biases, missing perspectives or voices, and any Western-centric assumptions. Next, they are asked to cross-reference AI-generated content with at least 2 academic sources from their module to verify, double-check and verify accuracy, and to also identify gaps. And then, and this is to me the most relevant, almost the most relevant part of the task, is to engage with Copilot to challenge any detected biases through follow-up prompting. So you enter into a dialogue with the GPT that has supported you in carrying out the task. And the third bit is the critical reflection bit that I hinted at earlier on. Process reflection and critical AI literacy development. So the students are asked to compare, so reflect on both the more traditional process in part 1 and the AI-assisted exploration in part 2. And to describe the steps that they've taken in both parts and to compare both approaches to carrying out the task and to doing their research. And then they are asked to analyze one ethical concern they encountered in part 2 when they used AI, and to share how they then addressed this concern. They are asked to consider the environmental and social impact of using AI for academic work in general and for this task in particular. And then also to propose how tools such as Copilot could be used more inclusively to explore citizenship concepts, particularly for students from widening participation backgrounds, which is, as I've told you, particularly relevant for us at the Open University. Okay, so let's move from a social sciences example to a STEM example. So this is about analyzing climate data through an equity lens. So the traditional approach is analyze and provide a data set on local temperature changes over the past 30 years for 3 different regions: an urban center, a rural agricultural area, and an indigenous community territory. And then they are asked to calculate basic statistical measures for temperature changes. They are asked to create at least 2 visualizations showing temperature trends and to identify patterns and anomalies in the data. And then they are asked to discuss potential impacts on each community, so urban center, rural agricultural area, indigenous community, considering their different vulnerabilities and their capability to adapt to climate change. And finally, they are asked to explain their methodological choices and any assumptions they made in carrying out this task. Now, let's look at the AI-enhanced activities, an AI-enhanced version of this activity, but through an equity lens. Use AI tools to enhance your climate data analysis. It would be Copilot in our case, and then critically evaluate the outputs through an EDIA, from an EDIA perspective. So use Copilot to help interpret patterns in the data set you've been given. Request predictions about future temperature trends. And ask Copilot to identify which communities out of the 3 might be most affected and why. And in your critical AI analysis, prompt Copilot specifically about climate impacts on marginalized communities. Document how Copilot represents or fails to represent indigenous knowledge systems about climate. And identify whether there are any Western-centric assumptions in Copilot's analysis of climate adaptation strategies for each of these communities. And then run the same climate query 3 times with different community contexts, again, urban, rural, indigenous, and document the variations in AI responses, and then cross-reference Copilot's predictions with peer-reviewed environmental justice literature from your module. And again, engage in an exchange with Copilot and challenge it when it provides solutions that may not be accessible to all communities for a variety of reasons. And again, in part 3, finally, the reflection and the methodological critique. Compare your manual analysis with AI-assisted findings. What perspectives or insights Copilot has missed? how Copilot might perpetuate environmental racism or climate injustice, and the carbon footprint of using Copilot for the climate analysis in the first place. Then also data justice considerations, discuss who is represented or missing in the climate data sets, analyze how data collection methods might exclude certain communities, and propose how AI could be used to amplify marginalized voices in climate science. And then to take it even a step further, this is really an ideal scenario. Identify one specific way Copilot or AI could help address climate injustice. Document your AI prompts and responses. When AI provides climate solutions, evaluate their feasibility across different socioeconomic contexts. Consider how language barriers might affect AI tool accessibility for the affected communities. And explore whether AI training data includes climate impacts from the global south. And finally, reflect on who benefits from AI-driven climate research and who might be excluded. Oops, I don't know, I jumped ahead. That was not my, I don't know what's happening. It's running away from me. Sorry. And this activity develops both technical STEM skills and critical AI literacy while maintaining a focus on social justice implications of using AI in scientific research, but also in the social science studies. And I'm not saying that this is the only thing we should be doing moving forward, but I'm saying is that we can do two for the price of one. We can develop AI literacy, we can develop critical AI literacy, and we can do work that is grounded in equity, diversity, inclusion, and access principles. And if you have students that come from a widening participation background like we do, this might also be relevant to you. I'd even go further and say, even if the majority of your students don't come from such a background, it is still ethically important to raise awareness to this effect. Now we are in the process of embedding this framework across OU modules and programs, as and when the opportunity arises, when we produce new modules, when we remake existing modules or have midlife reviews of existing modules. We are engaged in staff development activities to that effect, so to build our staff's critical AI literacy through continuous professional developments. We are offering workshops on a regular basis. We are, in our assessment design, we are developing approaches that integrate AI tools responsibly, but beyond that, also focus on critical AI literacy skills development in that sense, that is in that EDIA-focused spirit. And we've started to engage also not only across the institution, but also at the national level and internationally in collaborations with colleagues who are interested in this approach and have started to share their practice in that space. And of course, we very much hope to contribute to sector-wide policy, so in shaping the UK higher education sector's response to AI in education through and with our approach. And with that, I say thank you. And now it doesn't let me move. And pass on to Duygu, my colleague Duygu, who is a lecturer in the Quality Enhancement and Innovation team at the Institute of Educational Technology at the Open University. Duygu's research and teaching focus on generative AI in education, on learning analytics and instructional technologies, with a strong emphasis on ethical and inclusive and institutionally embedded approaches. Over to you, Duygu.
Fantastic, Mirjam. Thank you very much. Let me see if I can control the slides. Yes, I can. Brilliant. So good morning, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me well. So thank you for the introduction, Mirjam. Yes, I am Duygu Bektik from IET, Institute of Educational Technology. I lecture in IET, and I have been co-leading the design and evaluation of Scribe, which is the OU's institutional, one of the OU's institutional AI assistants for curriculum development. What you've just heard so far, two important perspectives. Simon shared what students are telling us about their assessment experiences, the anxieties, the desires for transparency, the emerging patterns of AI use. And Mirjam outlined the OU's critical AI literacy framework, how we are positioning AI not just as something to police, but as something to teach with and thorough. My part is where two strands kind of meet the road, and I'm going to show you how we have built a practical prototype tool that could respond to what students are asking for while embodying the principles Mirjam described. And the title here is Designing with Purpose is Deliberate. So this isn't AI that automates course production, it's AI that helps educators to think more inclusively, more efficiently about assessment design. And I'm going to show you what I mean. Let me change the slides if I can. Brilliant. So before I introduce the Scribe itself, I want to make the connection to what you have just heard a bit more explicit. So on the left, some headline figures from Simon's student surveys, the CFR surveys. So these are striking numbers, you know, like 88% of students want to see the criteria, for instance, that will be used to mark their work. So there's nearly 9 in 10 students saying, show me what you are looking for. 82% want to access the model answers and marked examples, and you know they want to see what good looks before they want to submit, and 59% want to say more in the type of assessment they do. You know, so that's one size doesn't fit all. And we know that students are maybe not much, 1/3, you know, 25%. I think Simon was saying they're already started to use AI for revision, understanding, practice questions. So they are not waiting for us to figure this out. And on the right, you know, the critical AI literacy principles Mirjam outlined, the EDIA lens, ensuring AI is anti-racist, accessible, inclusive. It's not bolted on afterwards, but it's designed it from the very start. And the recognition, the staff need to develop AI literacy themselves before they can support students efficiently and effectively, and also critical prompting and evaluation. So not accepting AI outputs, but knowing how to shape them and judge their quality. So fundamentally, seeing AI, you know, as a conduit of learning, you know, not just primarily for detection or policing problems. So what would be a practical response could look like to these two overarching themes? So we need tools that help course teams to create transparent, visible assessment criteria, because, you know, the 88% said that. We need ways to generate model feedback that explains why answers are right or wrong, because that's formative, it's not just evaluative. And we need to build accessibility and inclusion into assessment design from the very start, not just as an afterthought, as I said. So that's what Scribe can come in as an example prototype, sure, and I'm going to show you now. So that's where we are. This is the session structure. As you've seen, we moved from evidence, what students tell us, to principles, how to frame AI pedagogically, and now in practice. So, you know, a raw matters here because, you know, this is an evidence to practice pipeline example. Simon's data reveals within the pedagogical framework Mirjam has just explained. What is Scribe? Scribe is one of the OU's institutional AI assistants for curriculum development. It's been in development since late 2023 and in pilot use across all 4 OU faculties for over a year now. And at its core, Scribe is an authoring companion. It supports content creation. It helps course teams to move from blank page to a structured drafts much faster. It is designed to help course teams to draft, adapt, and repurpose learning materials efficiently. So it's a tool built for authors to give them a safe space to explore what Gen AI can do in course production. And there are 4 key characteristics that could define it. First is safe and secure. Scribe runs entirely within the OU's own Azure environment. It runs on our Azure OpenAI subscription with region-specific data controls. So when you are working with draft course content, assessment questions, or marking criteria, the material stays within the institutional boundaries. We are not sending it to external AI providers, so data is not used to train them. So it's built like a walled garden, if you like, for safe exploration. The second key characteristic is that it's user-driven. It's a user-driven design. Scribe was developed through a bottom-up and user-driven process. So we built Scribe with course teams, not for them. So we co-design it with authors, test it in real course production, which fed into some more design improvements and additional new functionalities. And this cycle goes on and on and on. So every assistant that Scribe has, which I'm going to show in a minute, has been shaped by real workflows, real frustrations, and real feedback from academics doing the curriculum work. And there are specialist assistants. So rather than one general purpose chatbot that tries to do everything, Scribe has purpose-built assistants for specific tasks. There's an assistant for quiz design, another for sketching VLE activities, another one for rubrics, for instance, and thinking partners. So this is a crucial one because we don't want Scribe to just produce outputs. So we want it to be like a thinking partner. So it asks clarifying questions to the user. It recommends approaches based on pedagogical principles that is fed behind the screen. And it invites iterative refinement in the chat. So educator remains in control throughout. We currently have over 130 registered users from all OU faculties and with a year of evaluation data, as I said. Very quickly, this is what you would see if you would log into Scribe. It's a straightforward, intuitive interface. You select an assistant, you start a conversation, and you work through your task. This is my homepage. There are different assistants for different purposes. For instance, the multilingual content translation assistant, persona builder assistant, quiz designer, and many others. There is also the create new assistant option, which is important. So course teams can customize existing assistants, or they can create entirely new ones for their specific disciplinary contexts. And because the course production is collaborative, Scribe also has this social rail through this create new assistant functionality, supporting shared assistance prompts so that teams can build on each other's work and inspired by others' assistant instructions, align practice, or maybe, develop this collective expertise. Users can access bespoke assistants tailored for the course they are authoring or tailored for the specific production task they may have, which I will come in a minute. So each user is assigned to their faculty user area. For instance, here on the screen, what you see is the list of assistants for our IET authors. So this user area, for instance, has assistants for every single CPD course IET has been producing over the past year. And each module has its own assistant preloaded with context such as module learning outcomes, existing course materials, assessment strategy documents, faculty guides. So, the assistant knows your context before you even start typing. This means less time explaining and hopefully more time designing. And each assistant is also configured with guidance on tone, style, audience, context, and this is done with the course team, obviously. So the users can focus on the creative part. And there are also some prompt helpers, basically suggested starting points for common tasks if you are not sure what to ask to begin with. Now, because this session is assessment focused, I'm going to show some examples of Scribe's assessment toolkit. There are 4 assessment focused assistants I'm highlighting today. One is quiz designer. It creates diagnostic Moodle quizzes with varied question types and formative feedback. Remember that 82% of students wanted, the model answers and feedback, right? And this can deliver that because every question comes with explanation of why answers are correct or incorrect. Then there is the VLE activity sketch, which generates complete learning activities across all 5 learning design types, mapped to available VLE tools. It helps embed assessment through learning journey, so it's not a summative endpoint. Rubric assistance, it drafts assessment rubrics aligned to task requirements, criteria. This can again address Simon's survey of 88% of students wanted to see what markers are looking for. And learning outcome mapping, it helps design activities, assessment tasks, and this through module outcomes, program goals, and graduate attributes. So each assistant here asks clarifying questions to the user, it recommends approaches, and invites to an iterative refinement. So let me go deeper on quiz designer assistant, because it illustrates the approach well. So what it does, it creates as I said, diagnostic model quizzes using the question types our VLE actually supports. It prioritizes pedagogy over format, so it chooses question types based on learning goals, not just for the variety's sake. And crucially, it includes formative feedback, explaining why answers are incorrect, and this, transform quiz from a test into learning opportunity. The question types fall into 3 categories. So there are selective questions that you can create, like multiple choice, true, false, matching, or matrix, which is good for the recall of information. Then there is semi-structured ones, the ordering, drag and drop, or selecting a missing word, like fill in the blanks. So test, understanding the relationships. And then the third option is the constructive one, which is, a short answer with pattern matching, free responses. So requires students to actually generate answers. And here on the footer, I said, this is supporting low stakes, confidence building assessment that addresses students' anxiety, which is hopefully supporting what Simon's data also show. So this is an example, a real life example. Obviously, I haven't put the whole dialogue here, but just to give you some idea of what a real conversation could look like to make things a bit concrete. So here in this example, a user starts, I want to create a quiz for library activity, and my learning outcomes say spotting an email scam and deal with it, okay? So what assistant does, it doesn't immediately generate the question for them. It asks, okay, how many questions do you like? Do you want them to be recall checks or mix, or more application scenarios? And the user says, okay, I want 5 questions with mix of checks and apply. So then assistant generates the question, which I highlighted in yellow here, which is a key moment. I think the user asks, okay, is question for accessible for disabled students? So the assistant explains, for instance, at this point that, okay, this was a drag and drop question. This can be a bit problematic for screen reader users or students with motor impairments. It proposes 3 alternative question formats that could test the same learning outcome a bit more accessible. So this is what I meant when I say the thinking partners. The assistant surfaces consideration, the user may not have thought, or they could iteratively do it together. So this kind of embeds Mirjam's EDIA principles into assessment design. And on the right here, for instance, there are some examples, again, which I haven't given the details, but some real examples. Our users asked, some asked creating 21 question inclusivity quizzes, health and safety law quizzes, healthcare scenarios, AI and academic integrity quizzes, no multiple choice, scenario-based only quizzes, and there are lots more examples, but this is a couple to make things a bit more concrete. The second one is the VLE activity sketch. VLE activity sketch takes a little bit of different approach. So instead of quiz questions, it generates a complete learning activity based on course content and outcome, and it's grounded in our 5, learning design activity types. from LD framework, and it categorizes things into 5 types. One is assimilative, which is basically reading, watching, listening. So students take information. Communicative, so it's discussing, debating, sharing, students exchange ideas. And finding and handling, searching, analyzing, evaluating. And productive, creative, creating, writing, designing. So students produce artifacts and practice applying, experimenting, simulating. So the assistant maps activities into available VLE tools, forums, wikis, blogs, quizzes, or interactive media players. And for each activity, it provides a title, purpose, learning outcome, step-by-step instructions, VLE tools that may need, assessment criteria, the rubric, and optional extensions, and accessibility tips. So this is all the structure that's on the right-hand side here on this slide. You could see this is the structured output for each activity. And here is again on the left another real conversation. So user came this time and asked Scribe to provide content on, so they gave content on antibiotics and microbial resistance, plus 4 learning outcomes that they have for their undergraduate students. And again, assistant comes and asks clarifying questions. The Scribe asks, are there any time constraints for these activities? Are there any specific VLE tools you would prefer or you want to avoid? And then it generates 10 activities, 2 per learning design type, with the 5 learning design types I just showed in the previous slide, with complete specifications, tools, criteria, accessibility tips. And the user can say, okay, I like the discussion forum activity. Can you just, write this one? Let's focus on that one. Can you write the entire activity from start to finish? And then it kind of generates this structured output I just explained on the right-hand side. I'm not going to give into details of these, but there are kind of relevant already what I've said, and they're already embedded in the other 2 assistants. So these final 2 can be standalone assistants or can also be integrated in the previous 2 as an assessment design cycle. So the rubric assistant is, as the name says, it drafts assessment rubrics aligned to the task requirements, level appropriate criteria, clear performance descriptions, marking guidance, so that it improves the transparency and consistency. And then there is the learning outcome mapping, which help align the assessments with the existing module learning outcomes or any goals they have, or the student attributes and the validation requirements. So let's go on to the next slide. And this is how the assistant works. All the assistants on Scribe, and the step 1, they ask questions to the user. So assistant want to ask clarifying questions about the context, goal, preferences. Then they recommend, based on your response, it proposes approaches grounded in those pedagogical principles. And then in step 3, it generates draft outputs with questions, for instance, model answers, rubrics, model feedback, whatever the assistant doing. And then number 4 is refining. So it invites for iteration. Would you like us to adjust the difficulty level maybe? So the conversation is ongoing. It's not just, okay, here is your activity. So educator remains in control throughout. The assistant support thinking, not replace it, and the outputs are starting points for professional judgment. Here are some of what our course authors say. So these are from our pilot evaluation interviews we did last year. So Scribe came out with ideas that hadn't even crossed my mind. So this captures the creative expression Scribe might enable at times. So it's not just doing what you would have done faster. In some cases, it might even surface possibilities or probabilities that you may not have even considered. Second one said it saved us a couple of days for maybe 3 hours work. So efficiency matters here when obviously course teams are working under really intense time pressure, and time saved on groundwork time is returned to the thinking only humans can do. And the third and final one is, oh, I would be now reluctant to produce a course without it. So this kind of speaks in integration. So Scribe has become part of how some people work, not a novelty tried once and forgotten, which is good for us to carry on working on it. And finally, so if you want to take one thing from my talk, let it be this phrase. So thinking partners, not an autopilot. So Scribe assessment assistant, help course team, translate institutional priorities into practical design choices. It responds to what students tell us about assessment challenges, and it maintains pedagogical integrity while gaining efficiency. So the philosophy is simple. We are not trying to automate assessment design. We are trying to augment the educators who do it. And if you want to go deeper, here are some publications about Scribe from Scribe team, some reviewed journal papers, and also 2 Eden conference papers. So there are all DOIs are there if you would like to have a look further. And again, thank you for listening. And the Scribe project page is there if you want to look at it. You can find our approach, publications, updates there. And I'm happy to take questions today. And alternatively, you can always email me to discuss further. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Duygu, Mirjam, and Simon. And before we move to questions, I'd like everyone to thank our speakers. It's been a great set of presentations, and I'm sure it's spiked a lot of questions. I'd like everyone to thank our speakers in the usual way by giving them a great clap. Thank you so much, and thanks for listening. Now, we've had some questions in the chat, and there was one for Simon, which he's answered very well in the chat, which is great. Everyone can have a look at that. But I've got a question for Simon here because it raised all sorts of issues, and it was great to have, real data from our own students and how to support them with it, on what the needs are and how they're using it. But what do you think, Simon, these findings tell us about how we should move forward with AI and personalized learning?
Thank you, Denise. Yeah, I think both, yes, how I think the data frames that particular question, from what we've looked at so far, is that we clearly see that interest in learners to have more control over their assessment process. And we also know how challenging that can be, I think, in terms of assessment design, in terms of our module design more broadly. So I think what Duygu was talking about in terms of how we can use AI in the design side of things to create what will essentially be a more complex design to the ones that we're used to. The OU at the moment uses a very linear teaching approach generally, so that may be a way of us being able to nuance that and create a more appropriate choices and options for the learners. I think there was also a question in there about whether or how this could be used by the tutors, or at least whether the OU was using AI at the moment. And I think possibly in terms of being able to handle the variety that we introduce, because I think as educators as well, with learners exercising greater or lesser control, taking different personalized pathways, that then becomes very difficult just to keep track. And there may be a way in which AI can help support and to mediate that set of conversations, that dialogue between learners and teachers as well. I think also it maybe helps us with what Mirjam was talking about in the chat around the shift from policing to pedagogy, because clearly what we found was that there were students who were motivated by that strategic approach, by trying to get through some of the materials as quickly as possible. And I think there's a really interesting challenge there in terms of how we can work with those learners to sort of affect that kind of switch across. And that in itself, I think, may be about helping learners understand what their options and choices are around assessment, which I think will hopefully be more engaging for them, because it will be something which is more appropriate and relevant and interesting to them. And I think if we can use the assessment and we can use AI to achieve that, then we have a greater chance of engaging those learners and supporting that shift, I guess, across to a good critical use of AI.
Thank you, Simon. I've asked people to keep putting questions into the chat because we can respond to them later, but even if we run out of time. So, Mirjam, you've responded in the chat to some questions for yourself. I'd like to focus now about maybe the future and collective responsibility in moving forward with AI. So my first question is, how can communities most affected by algorithmic harms be meaningfully involved in designing the solutions?
I think the onus is on us. The onus is on us to invite them to the table, so to speak, to make sure, because we are in a place of privilege, and we have to use this place of privilege to the best possible effect in this space. And it is not that there are no knowledges and no epistemologies in other parts of the world, but we tend to focus on that, what is more easily accessible, what is more readily accessible. Now, why it is more readily accessible is in itself questionable. But I think we have to walk the extra mile. We have to make the investments. We have to create the times and the spaces to invite those colleagues to the table. And we have these contacts. We work with colleagues and institutions in those parts of the world that are underrepresented, whose knowledges are underrepresented online already anyway. And these knowledges will not be then accessed and harvested by the algorithms. Okay, so we are perpetuating a status quo. We are widening a divide, and that's why I think we, the privileged ones, have to make sure that these people come to the table in education. We cannot put the onus on them. The onus is on us. That's what I'm trying to say.
I understand that, but communities that can be harmed and are not representative, it's not just a question of working with universities in certain countries. These communities may have no electricity. So I'd like you to maybe expand on what more can be done in shaping socially just AI ecosystems, if you can.
I think, there is, of course, also informed opting out. Yeah. So really only draw on AI and use AI in education where we can use it for the greater good. If we cannot use it for the greater good, we may decide not to use it at all. And there are contexts where this may well be the right choice, like the one that you have just described. The other way of going about it is, of course, and I do that a lot in my virtual exchange scholarly work with colleagues from what is usually referred to the global south, go for the lowest common denominator when in your technology choices. So make sure that the very first step, accessibility, doesn't become the biggest hurdle.
Thank you, Mirjam. I'm going to move on to Duygu, but I have real concerns that, you see, we know where the biases are because we know the data that's going into these systems. And so if you've got a group of individuals who cannot participate, then the bias remains. However, my real concern is that the, these companies that are building this stuff, on the New York Stock Exchange are holding up the world's economy at the minute, an investment, and they will need a return. So it could well be that we who think we are privileged may not even be able to access in a way. But I just wanted to open these thoughts, not to deliberately put you on the spot, but just for our audience to think about when they go back to their institutions. And so thank you very much, Mirjam. Duygu, there are lots of questions for you, and I can see here, can we have Scribe? Seems to be, and this is wherever we go and talk about Scribe, can we have this? I'll let you answer those questions in one moment, but I'd like to ask you, you've now got a lot of data and usage, which is growing and becoming more accepted within the university. So, what are the real difficulties or constraints with Scribe? And how can we deal with teacher difficulty in producing good curriculum? How can we overcome these to develop new features with Scribe?
The current constraints, is obviously every course team's expectations and needs are various. So every course team and author, some of them has existing content they want to repurpose, build a new module, a new qualification. Some groups want to do cross-disciplinary work, creating, for instance, master's qualification for social sciences, but they want to, include examples from STEM modules. Or some course teams come and say, okay, this is completely new module, I'm starting from scratch. So, the various needs could be seen as a difficulty, but the way we kept Scribe simple, intuitive, and super flexible is that so we could kind of respond to different needs. If people have lots of materials and they don't want to, they don't know where to start from, what we could do is basically ingest all the materials they have to an assistant to reproduce content, start reproducing content from those. If people don't know where to begin with no, text available, existing module available, we kind of guide them to these could be their papers they've written, even brainstorm ideas, even post-it notes, that they could make a start. Or we let people to look at other module materials to draw on, for instance, a STEM-related examples for an FBL module, a business module, let's say. So, there are different various ways that we could use Scribe flexibly. The current constraint is obviously the needs. So what we have been doing in the Scribe cycle is that myself and another colleague of mine, Thomas Ullman, that we worked as AI buddies to, guide course teams in the process. But because the user base is growing, people are, expecting more, it might be difficult to navigate these workflows. So in the future, to maybe overcome these, we need to find a way to have who can, help course teams to become an AI buddy so that they use Scribe or similar tools efficiently for their needs. I don't know if that answered your question, Denise, but let me know if it didn't.
That's very clear. Duygu. Now, I'd like to ask all of you to come in now and to open the debate to say, how do you think AI use is going to change and accelerate pedagogy moving forward? Because I'm sure our audience would like some insights, and not least myself. So can we start with Simon, and then to Mirjam, and then to you, David?
Wow, that's a great question, Denise. I think at least in the first instance, it's making us think about our pedagogy a lot more, and I think it's bringing to a head those decisions that we've perhaps been or changes that we've been either putting off or not necessarily being able to get the support perhaps from the university to make. I think it's exposing some areas which we need to think more about, and I think we already have a number of solutions, or at least we're aware of a number of some of these challenges. I think the AI is going to sort of help us to refine and improve those designs, our approaches. I think it's also making us, I think certainly with respect to assessment, is to really critically think about the relationship between summative and formative assessment. I think we've always been able to often roll those together and think about assessment as quite comfortably performing both of those functions often simultaneously. I think as we're increasingly aware of and can see what AI is capable of doing, and that presents especially a challenge to summative assessment, I think therefore thinking about how those two issues relate to each other, what the needs of an institution are in terms of what assessment does, and what the role of assessment is for the learners, and how we work those two things together, I think could present us with some interesting thoughts, and maybe we will find ourselves having to adapt our teaching and learning a little bit according to the answers that we get from that.
Thank you so much, Simon. And let's hear from Mirjam.
I think it forces us to really fundamentally rethink what it means when we say we are open to people, places, and ideas in our mission. It brings to the fore that we are incredibly exposed. It brings to the fore that we have to go back to the drawing board if we really want to walk the talk in terms of being inclusive. Like the questions you asked me, and that we have to really, really fundamentally rethink what education is, what learning and teaching is in generative AI times, and how we can make sure that it is not becoming a venture for the privileged.
Thank you, Mirjam. And Duygu.
I said in my presentation as well, I think that students are already using it. They are not waiting for us to figure this out. How we are going to use, AI in our assessment practices, and we are living in this age now, digital, the Gen AI era, and we need to look our pedagogies, look our assessments, and we need to make adaptations rather than just policing. That was our original reaction when things were out, right? Okay, how am I going to police my students who are using AI in their assignments? But rather like how we can, maybe with the help of Gen AI, change our assessment practices, our pedagogical approaches, so that we are adapting our pedagogies in this day and age, I would say.
Thank you, Duygu. I must confess, I did think about this before we started this session. And what kept coming up in my mind is about the role of the teacher. It really has got to change.
Yeah.
And all through my time of learning and taking exams and getting qualifications, the teacher was an authority because it's giving, you know, some qualification. There's an authority about what must be learned. And I think we've got to change from being an authority to very much a co-learner. And AI evolves quickly. It's, you know, you've been building Scribe, we've been working with AI. Mirjam has been leading here in the university and helping with principles, etc. But it evolves so quickly. So we've got to go rather from mastery of fixed content to becoming curious learners. So Mirjam and then Simon, and then we'll be out of time and we'll have to finish.
And an important role of the teacher, of the pedagogue, is at this current stage, the awareness raising stage. I see us very much at the stage of raising awareness for the challenges and only starting to figure out a way in collaboration with our colleagues, with our learners, of how we are moving forward with the use of generative AI for learning and teaching and assessment purposes. We are at the very beginning of a very long and potentially challenging but also exciting journey.
Thank you, Mirjam. And I'm going to give you the last word, Simon.
I'll be brief then, Denise, and this builds, I think, on your point, but I think certainly the question of trust and about veracity. We've looked in CFAR, for example, at the trust, the issue of trust with respect to the students and the teacher, and I think one aspect of that changing role is going to be, what does trust mean, and how do we manage that in the future?
Thank you, Simon. But more importantly, thank you to you, our audience, who've been with us today. We've had a lot of people join us. I think at one stage we had about 78 to 80. So that's absolutely marvelous. Please, if you have any more ideas or questions, do get in contact with us. And thank you so much for joining us. Have a good day. And please, if you can, come and join us in the sessions throughout this week. But thank you, Simon, Mirjam, and Duygu, very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you.
And goodbye.
Thank you, Denise, for being such a wonderful host. Thank you.
Bye-bye.